Okay, hi. Today I'm going to speak about coral reefs. And they're some of the oldest, most amazing structures on Earth today, and they are rapidly declining because of humans. The ocean is one of the most diverse habitats in the world, and coral reefs are the most diverse ecosystem in the ocean, and it's in great danger. I believe that the first step to getting a better solution to this problem is raising awareness. Losing the coral reefs would have a significant economic, social, and environmental impact on the world. So first, I'm just going to talk about what coral reefs are. These are actually living organisms called polyps. And this is a picture of a polyp, and this is like the individual living units that make up a whole coral reef. And they belong to the phylum Cnidaria, like jellyfish. And polyps form reefs by covering a hard surface, and they're pretty sensitive to their environment. So they have specific conditions that they need to live under. And they live in large communities and create a population we know as reefs. There are different types of coral reefs. There are three main types, and there's a fringing reef, a barrier reef, and an atoll, and they form around like small islands or even volcanoes. This is basically the progression that a reef goes through to form. Like this is the earliest, and then over a course of very many years, it'll form those. So it can take up to 10,000 years for corals to settle and grow into this reef formation. And as land erodes around the coral grows higher and the land grows lower. And under good conditions, it can take 100,000 years to become a barrier reef. And an atoll reef can take up to 30 million years. And typically, coral grows at a rate of approximately 2 centimeters per year. But there's types of branching corals that can grow up to 10 centimeters per year. And one of the most famous reefs is the Great Barrier Reef, and it's 93 miles wide and 1,242 miles long. Okay. This shows, I'm going to talk about how reefs start to form. So that's back there. They usually begin to form on a seabed with warm, shallow water, and the first step to formation is the reproduction of coral. Coral reef produces sexually, and the eggs are fertilized, and then the larvae float around in the ocean until they find a suitable place to settle, which is basically a solid place on the seafloor with desirable living conditions. The coral then secretes a hard shell and begins its life, and from this point on, it will not move. The polyp then begins to reproduce by budding asexually, and then it builds off as its own structure. So as the coral dies, it will build up new coral on top, and that's how the coral structure grows. Okay. The location of most corals is limited because of their sensitive living conditions. Corals prefer water temperatures of like 23 to 29 degrees Celsius, and they can't really adjust to major changes in temperature. So they can really be affected by subtle changes like 1 degree. They can't survive at temperatures under 18 degrees and above 40 degrees Celsius. So mostly they're concentrated in fairly warm tropical areas. They also prefer very salty water. The water has to be clear because the light needs to be able to get through the water enough to allow the coral to grow and develop. And this is why reefs are not really found in deep water. So they survive best in tropical and semi-tropical locations. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about the problems that are causing the reefs to decline. The main cause of coral reef destruction is humans. 10% of the world's reefs have been completely destroyed, and 70% have either been threatened or destroyed, but may be able to be regenerated. One major cause of this is the rising temperature of the oceans. This can really make the coral get sick and die. Pollution is another major cause. There are all different types of pollution that are leading to the destruction of coral, like land-based runoff from construction and erosion of sediment, which might not seem bad if soil runs into the ocean, but that can cause the water to become murky, and then less sunlight will reach the coral, causing it to die. So, also agricultural pesticides can get into the water and kill the coral. Deforestation can cause erosion into the ocean, and sewage treatment is a major issue because pollutants can enter the water that way and change the conditions of the water. And also the sediment that comes from this pollution can increase nutrients, which increases algae growth on the coral, which can cause bleaching, bleaching is shown right here. It's when coral becomes damaged and it stops growing because it releases the algae that stays on it. It has a symbiotic relationship with algae that stays on the coral that helps it to grow. And if the conditions are too stressful, it releases that and it bleaches and stops growing and dies. Also, overfishing and destructive fishing practices like blast fishing is a big problem. Blast fishing is when they use dynamite and throw it down into the coral to scare fish out of their hiding places, and this can break the coral, and it can really decimate the population of fish. And the ecosystem of coral is really close-knit, so if one species is totally decimated, it really affects the whole system. Also, cyanide fishing, it stunts the fish to the surface, and it also damages the reef. More than 40 countries are affected by blast fishing, and more than 15 countries have reported cyanide fishing activities. Other damaging fishing techniques include deep water trawling, which involves dragging a fishing net along the sea bottom, which can break off the coral. And a lot of coral is harvested to sell and make jewelry out of, and that's a major problem. And mining for coral and building materials is also a major problem in this. And also just pollution of trash is another big issue. So I'm going to talk about why reefs are so important to our society. Coral reefs have been called some of the most productive and diverse ecosystems on Earth. Coral reefs are an essential part of the complex marine ecosystem, and although coral reefs occupy less than 0.25% of the marine environment, reefs support more than a quarter of all known fish species. Reefs shelter every single group of animal except for mammals and insects. It's an extremely diverse and interconnected ecosystem. It has sponges, which provide shelter for fish and crabs, anemones, which have a symbiotic relationship with clownfish. It has worms, sea stars, a variety of schooling and solitary fish, which draws sharks. There's shrimps, crabs, and lobsters, octopuses, squids, clams, and scallops. And all of these rely on each other, so decimating one of even these species can really harm the whole reef. It's really hardly an exaggeration to say that without reefs, millions of these organisms would die. Scientists have also estimated that there might be another 1 to 8 million undiscovered species of organisms living around the reefs. So if we destroy these ecosystems, we could really be missing out on a lot. In addition, coral reefs are beneficial for several other reasons. They provide a significant source of food in many other countries. Mollusks from the reefs can feed about between 30 to 40 million people every year in the communities that live close to the reef. Reefs also provide a significant source of incomes to countries. Economies provide tourism to the reefs, and that really provides a lot of their income for running that country, like diving.